one of these terms that I have problems with, not just terms actually, but ideas, concepts, is faith. Faith. Particularly religious faith, but I think you get faith in other areas as well. I was listening to a program on the radio, well it wasn't actually, it was a download from the radio in the car last night on Lysenko, the Russian agrobiologist, whose biological theories were really behind a lot of the famines that took place in Russia in the early part of the 20th century. And they really took off, I guess, because people had faith in him, or Stalin had faith in him, and made faith in Lysenkoism pretty much compulsory. So it's not just religious faith. I think there can be scientific faith or quasi-scientific faith as well. But I don't really. Do I understand? I don't know how I understand it, I suppose is more accurate. I don't fully know how I understand it, and even to the extent I do understand it, there seems to be some kind of anomalies in it for me, and some strangenesses about it, which are intriguing. I mean, to the extent that I do know how I understand it, and I'm not totally convinced by this, I have to say, is in relation to belief. Because as I understand it, faith is believing without evidence. Believing without evidence. If you accept the principles of a proposition without any kind of evidence given for that, then you are taking that proposition on faith. Now it might be because you're submitting to authority, which is a kind of evidence, I guess, or it might be that you're submitting to, well, I don't know, some other kind of support for that belief. But either way, there's no evidence for it, therefore you're engaging in some kind of an act of faith. That's the understanding that I have, and that's certainly the case with religious faith. And just to go back to the example I used a minute ago, that was true of Lysenkoism. Despite years and years of and endless 5-year plans, which were supposed to double the amount of winter wheat that was grown, all that kind of stuff, kept failing. The evidence was completely lacking. They kept doing it. They kept following Lysenko principles of agrobiology. So it's belief without evidence. So if I'm going to understand faith, I have to, and by understand, I think I mean kind of find out how I'm embodying it in some way, or what kind of physical schema, or what kind of kinesthetic or embodied or perceptual schemas I'm drawing on to form my understanding of that. Then to understand faith, I need to understand belief. And when I've been thinking about belief before, I think the dominant understanding that I have of belief is drawn from understandings of seeing. I'm looking across at this tree here on this path near where I live. It's an old disused railway line called the Salt Line. But there's a tree next to it, and I'm looking at it right now. And the evidence of my eyes is overpowering. It would be very, very difficult for anybody to convince me that I was hallucinating that tree, or it wasn't there in some way. It seems to be kind of paradigmatic for my experience of belief. I believe in the existence of that tree because the evidence is overwhelming, and it's an evidence which is completely grounded in my biology, my perceptual system, ultimately my cognition. And it seems to me that's a really solid basis for belief. I think there's others as well which I've spoken about in other videos, but I think this seeing is believing thing is really crucial. So if faith is believing without evidence, then a kind of correlate for faith would be the one that I'm experiencing right now. I've got my eyes shut, I can't see the tree, I'm relying on the kind of circumstantial evidence at best of my own memory to tell me that the tree is there. If I was to spin around a few times and make myself a bit dizzy, there we go. Now I think the tree is over there somewhere. Obviously I can't see it, and I have a kind of slightly less solid belief in its existence at that particular point in space. So I'm having to rely slightly more on some other process. Let's call it faith. And of course, if I was to, I don't know, if I was to, I was miles off, by the way. The tree was completely different to where I thought it was, and there's probably extensions of that I can do, which would increasingly divorce my senses from their contact with the evidence of that sense. So I would, more and more belief and more and more faith would replace belief, if that makes any sense at all. None of it does, but some kind of other process would kick in. So that's the nearest thing I've got to a kind of embodied relationship to faith. I suppose other relationships are things like some kind of scientific theories, or not even scientific theories, but kind of vernacular theories about just what happens in the world. There's a car going past, an RAC van actually going past on the road down here near the golf course. Now there's a bread van going the other way. I believe that bread van, that RAC van, existed prior to my seeing it and prior to my hearing it. I don't actually have any evidence of that, so there's a small act of faith going on there. I wouldn't call it religious faith or Lysenkoism, but there is a small act of faith going on there. I don't know, it doesn't feel very convincing to me now I've said it actually, but I think there is something to do with that. I think to understand faith I would have to relate it to my other understandings of belief, which are to do with seeing, but also to do with submission and to do with kind of knowing and ownership and a variety of other kind of embodied concepts. The other thing about faith actually, which is more to do with religious faith, but perhaps political kinds of faith as well, is how faith can exist as an activity. I mean, certainly in some religious circles, it's considered the good thing to exercise faith in spite of evidence. It's not enough just to exercise faith, full stop. You have to exercise it in the face of contradictory evidence, and the more evidence you can resist, the greater your faith, and therefore the more exercising you've done and the greater a kind of spiritual body you've developed. There seems to be a kind of logic going on with that, with some faith practices, that it's considered, as I say, an act of spiritual bodybuilding to exercise one's faith. You present all this evidence against evolution, and you might deny it, or you might just compartmentalize it in part of your brain and engage in, and just allow it to be cognitively dissonant for a while. But a lot of the time I think people actively engage in spiritual weightlifting, pushing against this evidence, because it's a good thing to do. It's a kind of Calvinistic, muscular faith that's being developed, which quite frankly is a bit odd. Is a little bit odd. I don't know, there may be some uses for it. I'll have a think about that and maybe think of some kind of positives for that kind of practice. Not necessarily to do with religion, but in other contexts. At times when it is useful to deploy faith as if it was a muscle. Yeah, I'll have to think about that.